Opinions stated in this podcast should not be used as evidence. Assume that any cited evidence can be found in the related Candor Briefs releases. Thank you, and welcome to Former Partners.
Hello, and welcome back to the Former Partners podcast. I am Lucas.
And I am Quentin.
And it's so good to have you here listening with us tonight. This is episode 7, and it is set up to be our in-depth episode on the Saudi Arabia public forum topic.
The February topic, which comes in tomorrow.
Yes.
Or today, if I upload this late, which I probably will.
You usually do.
You usually do. You're absolutely right. What we're going to be doing today is looking at some more specific evidence, some more specific arguments, and actually reading a couple cases and doing a couple short debates on the topic.
Before we do that, though, we have a little bit of a housekeeping issue to address on our last episode.
We tried to do an explanation into some more, quote, advanced strategies of public forum and debate in general. One of these being link turns. Now, we kind of butchered it, to be honest. In our circuit, link turns and what's called no-link arguments were explained to be the same thing. Everybody used the terms interchangeably. That is not the case. We were incorrect on this. That's our fault. We should have looked more into it, but we just didn't. So, if you listen to our last episode, and, I'm about to sneeze.
Bless you.
Yeah, thanks. If you listen to our last episode and were a little bit confused on link turns, you have every right to be, because we were just wrong. If you're interested, there's a really good explanation on the Reddit post. A lot of people find us from Reddit, so if that's the case, in the Reddit post itself, there was a good comment explaining the difference between no-link arguments and link-turn arguments, and I learned a lot from it, just that one comment, so it could be beneficial for you.
I think that really reinforces our little forward we do in the beginning of the episode, where we say anything that we say can't really be used as evidence, that this is meant to be used as an educational tool.
Right.
We're not experts, and we're not always going to be right about things. We're going to misquote things, and we really appreciate you guys helping us keep it educational and keep it on track. Yeah. Please point out those mistakes when we make them.
Yeah, I remember when I read that out, it actually made me happy that somebody cared enough to give us some criticism and correct
for sure.
us, It
means a lot. I mean, because, any kind of publicity is good publicity, and the fact that people are looking at this like a serious project and actually giving feedback, it does mean a lot. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. So, sorry about the link turns. Thank you for correcting us.
We will work harder to be better in the future.
We'll be better in the future, for sure. Another thing that we wanted to talk about before we get into the actual debates is the Recency app. This is going to be something we're going to be releasing hopefully in the next couple weeks to a month.
It's super cool.
Yeah, it's in beta right now, so we're testing it with some debaters that we mentor. The point of it's hard to explain without looking at it, but the point of it is just to be able to click on whatever topic you're interested in and get the most recent updates on that topic possible.
It's kind of like I know Android has it, I don't know if Apple has it, but I believe it's called Newsroom, and it's essentially you pick a handful of news sources and it kind of breaks it down into genres for you. So like tech news, world news, US news, stuff like that. And it just makes it easier to sift through the information. And I think that's the same kind of goal that we have with Recency.
Yeah.
But with debate specific information.
Right. The way it works is if you do public forum, you click public forum and you click whatever month topic you're interested in, and it's going to pull a huge news feed to the second of anything related to the topic, any news articles or any updates on the topic, so that you can just see them riding the bus to the tournament or taking a break at home from cutting research, whatever.
We're
Just at your
also
fingertips.
hoping to have an extemp section
Yes.
of the app. Will that be included in the initial release?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep, that's part of what we're testing now. It's not, yeah, there's a section for public forum, LD policy, and extemp. Extemp is going to be split up in domestic and international, and subtopics from there. Politics, economy, world economy, that kind of thing.
What's the likelihood of us ever doing a similar app where we compile a database of DI and HI scripts?
I hadn't thought about that. That'd be interesting. I don't know. I feel like there'd be issues with some copyright stuff with that, but it'd definitely be worth looking into.
I think it's in the same regard as using it in a public or in the debate world. You're not making money off of it. You're not using it and saying it's your own. You're giving credit to the author, and you're just doing it as a performance.
Yeah, that is true.
And as long as we make sure we're
talk
not
to some people about that.
Yeah, as long as we're not making any money off of that portion of the app or the separate app that we use for that.
Yeah.
It's just a free resource. We should be in the clear, I think.
Yeah, that would be really cool. Good idea. Let's talk about that some more.
Yeah, for sure. We'll get that off.
Yeah.
Off mic. Let me make a note.
Yeah, I'd never considered something like that.
Well, yeah, because I mean, there's so much published. There's so many published works that you sift through whenever you're going to do those kinds of events that it's a little overwhelming. I think that having an app like that could be very helpful.
Yeah, just a database.
Let us know down below if a database of scripts and or poetry and prose pieces kind of compiled under an application, if that's something that you'd be interested in. If that sounds like a good idea, we'll try to move on it. If you think you guys will hate it, then we won't do it.
Good idea, Mr. Monroe.
Thank you, sir. That being said, we're going to do a couple practice debates for y'all today.
Yeah, so some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about, maybe not, who knows. Debates are different every time. There's some specific arguments that I think are really interesting on this topic. So let's look at this at pro and then con. So on pro, something that if you don't know about, something you need to know, is about the rally around the flag effect. It's the effect that it's almost a martyr effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's how the Patriot Act was passed in the United States.
Right.
It is whenever a country or a group of people with a identity that they share, whenever they are under attack from a clearly identifiable source, whether that be drug dealers, terrorists, a specific terrorist group like ISIS, it creates something called a rally around the flag effect, where the citizens of the country that's under attack are more prone to sentiment that is negative towards the people who are attacking them.
Right.
And as a result, they're more willing to allow their governments to do things that they wouldn't traditionally allow them to do.
Right.
In response.
And the Patriot Act is a great example. After 9/11, we had the rally around the flag effect, where we were totally willing to do anything to take out these people that harmed us and caused such tragedy in our country.
Yeah, even sacrifice some of our personal liberties.
Right. And that's the rally around the flag effect. In terms of this topic, what it means is, at least for pro, when we are supporting Saudi Arabia that is harming civilians, that creates a rally around the flag effect for those civilians and tense U.S. image, right? It makes...
Yeah, it creates anti-American sentiment in the Middle East, which there's a ton of that floating around anyway. So if Saudi Arabia, in the eye of the public in the Middle East, is attacking citizens, and then we're supporting Saudi Arabia, then it only stands to reason that the sentiment is also going to shift to us.
Yep.
That's the basis of the pro argument.
At least that one, yeah. There's another thing. Now, we're also going to be reading these as cases, but the Iran trigger is super interesting to me. It's not something that I had considered with this topic, because the conflict in Yemen is sort of a proxy war between, Saudi Arabia is fighting the Houthis, who are an extension of Iran, and Saudi Arabia is sort of an extension of us through the sales and support. The Iran trigger is an argument that essentially, since the United States supports Saudi Arabia, who is fighting a group supported by Iran, if something goes wrong, it ends with the United States in a war with Iran, which is not good.
So essentially, the follow on that and what links it back to the pro side is if continued U.S. support of Saudi Arabia is inevitably going to trigger this Iran conflict, we need to pull that support before the Iran conflict is triggered.
Because a U.S.-Iran conflict would not be good.
Yeah, which is
plain as day. It just would not be good.
It's really interesting. I want to look more into some of that evidence for sure, but it just doesn't seem to me like, from a military perspective, that it would really be so difficult. But
it never does.
That's what the evidence says, though.
Yeah.
So
we'll be talking about that as a case. Another case that we're going to be talking about is the legality case, which I think is a really strong argument on pro.
It's probably going to be the most common.
Yeah, that's in the briefs. Now, these are all example cases that are available in the briefs. That's called the default lay case. That's what I think will be the pretty general, not generic arguments, but I think that's what a lot of people are going to run. That's what would hit well with a lay judge, I think.
Yeah, and these briefs are when he's referring to these briefs, he's referring to the Candor briefs.
Yep, available at candor.com.
Yes.
Candordebate.com. I don't even know my own website.
Where any of the evidence that we ever talk about on the podcast generally will be in a release of the Candor briefs, and you're able to pick those up at the website. And if you stick it out and make it to the end of the podcast, you will actually be able to get a $5 discount code.
Yep. So, that reminds me. There will not be a second release for this topic for a couple of reasons. The first one being I've been having bad internet issues, which are being resolved this week. So if I was able to make a second release for this topic, I would be so behind and so rushed, it just wouldn't be the quality that I'd want it to be. Secondly, the March topic comes out tomorrow. And I know for a lot of people, maybe everybody, I don't know exactly how it works, but for a lot of people, the March topic is the district's topic, and that's an important one. So I want to be able to get started on that immediately and be able to focus on it without being rushed to finish the February topic, that kind of thing.
So yeah, no second release on Saudi Arabia. Sorry if you were really looking forward to that.
Yeah,
but we got to do what we got to do to keep our schedule. But without further ado, let's go back over. We just talked the pro arguments. Let's talk the con arguments real quick, and then let's get into some debates.
I think the default general con argument that you're going to hear most is going to be counterterrorism and security in the region. It's a pretty good argument. I think it's going to be the number one con argument, really, that our support helps with stability and security in the region through counterterrorism efforts.
I really think that oil is going to be a tough competitor for that first spot.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see oil just as much, if not more, as counterterrorism, just because Saudi Arabia is the number 2 provider for oil to the U.S.
Yeah. And I could definitely see that. There's blocks to it available in Candor briefs.
Well, and everybody loves talking economics because the impacts are so easy to quantify.
Yeah.
And so easy to show your judge and to link to their everyday life as well.
Right. Because if the price of oil goes up, that's not just higher gas prices. That's
higher everything.
Increased prices for everything that is shipped or created using any type of oil.
Yep. And that's only going to hit your wallet.
Yep. The next con argument that's more unique is the al-Mendab Strait.
It's really just a play on counterterrorism / instability, but it's a more specific case that is very realistic, I think.
It's sort of a combination of stability and oil, because the al-Mendab Strait is where Saudi Arabia ships their oil through. 4.7 million barrels every day get shipped through there. The issue is it's also right next to Iran, and the Houthi rebels in Iran are talking about and attempting to take control of the Strait to disrupt shipments of oil and trade, that kind of thing. So the argument on Khan is support Saudi Arabia to keep stability in that strait, to keep everything as it should be, freedom of navigation, that sort of thing.
And you can actually, you can even pull some of the Iran war trigger evidence from Pro to support that argument and show how naval conflict with Iran doesn't necessarily pan out well for the U.S. It's not that we lose, it's just that it's a very costly victory.
Yeah.
And from a tactical perspective, it's an operation that probably just wouldn't be performed. It would be considered too high risk.
Yep. And we'll actually be reading that case. And there is some of that. There is part of one of the pieces of evidence, one of the contentions says, if we let this get out of control, it'll be a situation where the U.S. has to intervene themselves and fight Iran for the Strait. So then you can use all those impacts. Because the pro impacts for the Iran trigger arguments aren't necessarily pro only. They're just impacts that are used by pro for the Iran trigger. They could be used for Khan for the Bab al-Mendab argument.
Yeah, and war is a full U.S. intervention in a war scenario is a really touchy thing in the modern era because, I mean, you see the statistics and hear the statistics in major news providers all the time about how the U.S. has a military that's 15 times more than the next person who spends on the military, or how you combine the next 25 countries together and it's only 70% of our military budget or whatever. We can't just go out and steamroll somebody because that looks really bad. That we totally have the ability to end a conflict with Iran overnight. Doing so hurts our image so bad that it's tactically not worth it.
Right. And geopolitically not worth it.
Yeah, we would be spending a lot of our social currency that we have built up with countries over the last, what has it been, 80 years since World War II and the foundation of the United Nations.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that social currency that we've built up with countries, this huge blanket of trust, we would just be throwing it out if we just steamrolled a country like Iran to keep our oil lines in track.
And, you know, we are doing a lot of things against Iran right now. We're trying to sanction their oil production, that kind of thing. But that's, you know, that's soft power. Hard power is a lot different.
Yeah, hard power has implications that even Quentin and I, through lots of research, wouldn't be able to predict or understand.
Yeah, that's why there are war games and war simulations.
Which we might actually talk about one of those.
Oh, we will.
Is that in the case?
Yeah, that's in the Iran trigger case.
Cool. That's a good piece of evidence to discuss.
Yeah. And the last con argument that I think is interesting is the weaponized oil argument. The idea that if we end support to Saudi Arabia, they'll actually weaponize their oil sales to us. They've done it before. 1973, they decided not to sell the United States oil anymore because of a decision we made regarding the Middle East.
Well, yeah, that kind of thing happens. That happens when people aren't even having a large superpower acting against them.
Yeah.
I think of the ice storms that happened 6 or 7 years ago in our area, and when people not the ice storms, the tornado that happened in Joplin, when people were looking for emergency shelter, and hotels and motels are jacked their rates up.
Yeah.
And overcharged people. Yeah, they price gouged them just because of opportunity that didn't even have an external military factor acting on it, and they were willing to do that. So I can definitely see the weaponizing oil argument having some ground.
And I mean, one of the things to back this up is the fact that there was a situation where Trump was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and this is in the case, so we'll get deeper. Oh man, we'll get deeper into it. He was on 60 Minutes and he just sort of sideways mentioned possibly like sanctioning Saudi Arabia if X and X happen, if they figure out something happened, and just him mentioning that it was a possibility, oil prices jumped for like a day.
Yeah, that's also because we have an incredibly overreactive market right now. Because currency isn't based in anything real, and it's almost all in the hands of public opinion. When stuff like that happens and the news reporters write 35,000 articles in 12 hours about how Saudi Arabia is going to murder us now, it can definitely cause some effects in the economy. And it's hard to say which of those effects are real and which one of them are just people overreacting.
Yeah. It's both.
It's one and the same, ultimately, is the thing.
Just based on the way our economy works, it is the same.
But
So
I think we're just about ready to start the first pro debate.
yeah, let me get my flow here. Okay, so if you're curious and want to pre-flow with us, the pre-flow for this case, it's a pro case. It's 2 contentions and 2 subpoints under the first. Contention 1 is Saudi Arabia is breaking international law with human rights violations. So, SA, breaking international law with rights. Subpoint A is the Saudi-led coalition targeting civilians in Yemen. And subpoint B is Saudis committing human rights violations on their own citizens. So this contention hits both international law with breaking human rights violations internationally and domestically against their own citizens. Contention 2 shows why that matters by saying arms sales to Saudi Arabia not permissible due to the violations. This brings up the AECA and the FAA, both of the acts, the US legislation about selling arms, and shows why the human rights violations makes it illegal for us to sell arms to those countries that do that, including Saudi Arabia. So this is the legal case, the case that essentially says we need to stop selling arms because it's literally against the laws we wrote about selling arms to other countries. So I'm gonna get my phone to time. Where's my phone? Oh. And here we go, if everybody's ready. My partner and I stand in firm affirmation of the resolution stated resolved. The United States should end its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It is because we believe Saudi Arabia is violating human rights and international laws, meaning arms sales are not permissible. We should end arms sales. Contention 1. Saudi Arabia is breaking international law with human rights violations. Subpoint A. Saudi-led coalition is targeting civilians in Yemen. Hard Tongue November 8, 2018 says, the conflict has been marked by violations of the laws of war on both sides, including targeting of civilians, torture, recruitment of child soldiers, and other abuses. There have been over 17,000 civilian casualties in the war, the majority of them via airstrikes carried out by the Saudi-led coalition. The Saudi-led coalition has undertaken over 18,000 airstrikes since March 2015, a third of which have hit non-military targets. Saudi bombing raids have targeted hospitals, marketplaces, civilian infrastructure, weddings, funerals, health clinics, and a school bus carrying dozens of children. Independent human rights monitors, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have found fragments of U.S.-supplied bombs near the sites of strikes on civilians. The bombs identified have included cluster munitions, which are now banned by an international treaty, and guided bombs manufactured by specific U.S. companies, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Hard Tongue tells us here that U.S.-supplied bombs have been used to kill over 17,000 civilians in the conflict in Yemen. The Saudis are bombing hospitals, marketplaces, weddings, funerals, health clinics, and school buses. We cannot support this. Even further, in our subpoint B, Saudis committing human rights violations on their own citizens. From Michael Newton, 2017. In addition to reports of widespread violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws in Yemen, there are credible reports of a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights within Saudi Arabia. The last 5 annual human rights reports issued by the U.S. Department of State reference allegations of torture and prolonged arbitrary detention in Saudi Arabia. The United Kingdom has designated Saudi Arabia as one of 27 countries of concern for wide-ranging and severe abuses. Saudi Arabia is breaking international law in the conflict with Yemen and committing human rights violations against their own citizens. This means we should not and cannot sell them arms, as we discuss in our contention 2. Arms sales to Saudi Arabia are not permissible due to the violations, from Clayton Thomas 2017. One legal analysis has concluded that the sales of arms, especially those used in airstrikes, to Saudi Arabia should not be presumed to be permissible under either the AECA and or the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. These limitations include prohibitions against the sale of weapons to countries that consistently violate human rights, restrict the delivery of humanitarian assistance, or use weapons in a way that differs, whether intentionally or not, from their originally agreed upon sale. What this tells us is that based on U.S. legislation over arms sales to foreign countries, we prohibit arms sales to governments that violate human rights and use the weapons to break international law. There are many awful things going on in Yemen, and morally, we should have pulled support a long time ago. But now we see that based on U.S. legislation, we cannot sell Saudi Arabia arms because of their targeting of civilians and domestic human rights violations against their own citizens. No matter which way you look at it, morally or legally, an affirmative ballot is necessary in today's debate. Thank you. So that was a little bit short, 3 minutes 40 seconds, but I hit everything I wanted to. Let's do a quick sweep over that again. Contention 1 is about the actual breaking of international law and the human rights violations themselves. We hit both international law through human rights violations in other countries against other citizens, where they have killed over 17,000 civilians using US supplied bombs, which doesn't look great for us and also is just obviously terrible. Civilian casualties are not preferable in any situation. And then in subpoint B, we hit actual domestic human rights violations where they are torturing and holding citizens for way too long in detention. And we actually show that the United Kingdom has designated Saudi Arabia as one of 27 countries of concern for wide-ranging and severe abuses of human rights. Now, this hits the moral side of things. Obviously, international law and human rights exist for a reason, for moral reasons based on human rights. But our contention 2 says that US legislation about actually selling arms, the whole thing we're talking about in this debate, makes it so that that's illegal. Based on our own legislation, we're not allowed to sell arms to these countries that do these things, and we have extensive evidence of Saudi Arabia doing these things. So, that's where the argument comes from. There's pretty good impacts in here. There's a lot of stuff that is almost heartstrings, which is not always a good thing, but in this instance, it's a good thing in this debate. You want the judge to feel for these people, for these citizens, both of Yemen and of Saudi Arabia that are being harmed by Saudi Arabian government using United States weapons. So you want to really tug on their heartstrings with that. So that's the case. And now it is time for Lucas to give his attacking speech. So he's going to attack, he's going to discuss his attack, and then I'm going to give a rebuttal. So let's get ready to do that.
With that being said, let's go ahead and get started and dive right into my opponent's first contention. Their first contention is pertaining to the human rights violations and legality associated with what's going on in the situation in Saudi Arabia currently. In their subpoint A, they're essentially talking about drone strikes and how a lot of drone strikes that have been carried out by the Saudi Arabian military, specifically with U.S. arms, which is what allows it to pertain to the resolution, have been causing a large amount of civilian casualties. To this, I have 3 responses. First response comes from Dunlap in 17, essentially saying that when you're talking about taking back heavily populated areas, casualties are unavoidable. We're not fighting for barren desert landscape in Saudi Arabia. We're talking about major cities with hundreds of thousands of people living in them that are currently in a war situation. There is literally a civil war happening inside of Saudi Arabia. If you think we're going to get out of this without a few civilian casualties, you're wrong. Plus, when we're talking about the concept of a ground invasion versus an air invasion, there's always, pretty much always, going to be more civilian casualties in a situation where we go in with ground forces rather than where we use drone strikes and air forces and things such as that. Furthermore, just because they're civilians doesn't mean they're innocent. This comes from the same author, Dunlap in 17, who goes on and expands further and says that these people that are living in these war-torn areas, just because they are marked up as a civilian casualty, this word is misconstrued in American media. We consider every single civilian casualty to be that of somebody innocent. They try to paint it as a child or as a woman who was just walking down the street and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yes, that does happen. I'm not saying every single civilian in Saudi Arabia is a terrorist, because that would be incorrect. What I am saying is that some of these people that are being marked as civilian deaths are people who are cooperating with the same terrorist regimes that we're attempting to suppress. They're just not far enough in or a high enough value target to be considered an enemy. However, that doesn't make them not bad or somebody that we could target in this instance. Furthermore, our third response comes from Hartung in 18, which is actually the same author that our opponents use in supporting this contention, who talks about how as of 2018, the Trump administration was actually pushing for better training to prevent human rights violations with military operations in Saudi Arabia. So under the status quo, because of U.S. involvement and U.S. aid going to Saudi Arabia, we're currently trying to fix this very problem. And what my opponent is advocating for is pulling out and just leaving them to their own means, which almost will definitely lead to more casualties in the future if they just try to do it their own way. And that leads us to their subpoint B, where they talk about how Saudi Arabian governments or the government of Saudi Arabia, is committing human rights violations on its own citizens. And they reference torture and long-term detainment without trial. Again, reference the Hartung 2018 evidence that I just brought up, which is, again, their same author. We're working with them on this. We're not going to say that Saudi Arabia is perfect. That's not what the con side is saying today. What we're saying is that the U.S. being there is better than the U.S. not being there. And simply put, if we don't have a stake in their economy, they have no reason to listen to us, and they have no reason not to do the things that we're saying are bad and do them even more so than they would if we weren't present. Furthermore, Chalet and Goldenberg in 2018 actually said that if we pull aid to Saudi Arabia, essentially they have no reason to comply with any of the changes that we've made to their military. So it's almost guaranteed that these human rights violations that my opponents are so worried about are only going to increase. So what we have today is a perspective where the opponents are essentially saying that we need to worry more about our image and how the United States looks in the global community than the actual civilians that they care about so much. If my opponents actually cared about these civilians, if they actually cared about these human rights violations, they would vote on the negative side, the side that keeps the U.S. involved with Saudi Arabia, and the side that prevents these atrocities from occurring. Now, really quickly to their second contention, where they talk about arms sales to Saudi Arabia are not legal under the status quo, and they're referencing the AECA and the FAA. I'm just going to quote some lines from the AECA really quick to combat this. And it says, quote, "It is the sense of Congress that all such sales be approved only when they are consistent with the foreign policy interests of the United States. Within the status quo, under current U.S. law, there are stipulations inside of these exact same acts that my opponents are trying to bring up as showing why we shouldn't be involved with Saudi Arabia that are supposed to prevent us from making sales to countries that are not in line with our interests. So if their big hang up here is that the AECA and the FAA are supposed to be shutting these sales down, there actually already are stipulations in both of those acts that stop us from selling to countries that are doing domestic terrorism and large amounts of human rights violations. And Congress has to approve those sales. The fact that the sales are happening in the first place is what makes this contention fall. And it's because of that and many more things that we're going to be talking about today's debate that I can see nothing but a negative ballot. Thank you. What's the time on that?
I didn't time it.
You didn't time it?
Nope.
Is your mic on now?
Nope.
You want to go ahead and turn it back on for me? Cool. So yeah, just talk about what we did really quick. So contention 1, human rights and violations and legality. They talk about drone strikes. Drone strikes cause civilian casualties. There's no way around it. It's not a perfect way to approach warfare. There is no perfect way to approach warfare. But when you're dealing with a situation like the one in Saudi Arabia, where it is mostly in civilian areas and largely densely populated civilian areas, regardless of the approach you take, whether it be by ground or by air, you're going to cause some civilian casualties, and there's really no way around that. All you can try to do is show that the approach we're taking via drone strikes is the most efficient in terms of eliminating targets and saving civilians. And that's what I tried to do right here with the block from Dunlap in 17. I also brought up the Hartung evidence, which is from the same author that the contention is from itself. And I think that that shows some significance that this author, although is writing a kind of negative view on Saudi Arabia and how they're treating their civilians, they're also pointing out the fact that the US is currently making an effort via military assistance to mitigate those civilian and human rights violations. So under the status quo, we're involved. Pro team's trying to say, hey, we need to not be involved because it's hurting our image. And I'm saying, no, the only way for us to mitigate these harms like you're saying we need to is not to just pull out and save our image. It's actually to stay in and keep giving them aid so that we can continue to refine their process. Furthermore, subpoint B is more about domestic human rights violations rather than international. The illegal detainment and torture of civilians are what would be considered illegal, not by Saudi Arabian standards is it illegal, but what would be considered illegal in the United States is a big deal. It is something that happens all over the Middle East. It's not a Saudi Arabian unique problem. And this contention is entirely built around the idea that we can't be giving money to a country that does something like this. We need to pull out and save our image. We're already doing it. We've already been doing it for 20, 30 years. And ultimately, the only way to stop it is to stay involved and keep trying to steer them in the right direction. And that's really the attack I went with on that point. And the contention, too, is just trying to call on status quo knowledge that there are agreements that say that we can't sell arms and provide military assistance to places and countries that are not in line with what we consider to be a standard for human rights. But in that same legislation, it also has articles about how we decide what countries are violating those human rights. And so I essentially just pulled the piece of legislation against itself and showed that within its own writing, it shows that Congress is supposed to essentially hold a vote, and the president is also supposed to decide before signing any of these instances of military aid and really make a calculated decision on if the country lines up with our foreign interests. And if it does, we go ahead and do it. So since we're doing it, I would assume that the status quo is working. So you can't really draw on the status quo to say that the status quo isn't working when the legislation that you're drawing on has stipulations for when it's not working. And that's all I was trying to show right there.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
I mean, I'll give him in my speech, in my rebuttal.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I forget we're doing that now.
Let's skip final focuses. There's really no need for them in this sort of format. Okay, so we're looking at the attacks made, and what we're going to try to do is respond to them as best we can. Now, we talk about this a lot. Rebuttals are difficult because he just spent 4 minutes attacking our case. And if I'm looking down the flow here, he put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 attacks over 3 points. So about 2 per point. And I have half the time to respond to that. That's the difficulty of rebuttals, and that's where collapsing arguments comes into play. How do I choose which of these to respond to, or where do I put my time? So after I give this speech, I'll sort of explain what the mindset was with this speech. So that being said, let's go ahead and begin. When looking at our first contention, subpoint A, about the civilian casualties in Yemen, my opponent said a few things. First, he said casualties are to be expected. Now, he also said that civilian doesn't necessarily mean innocent. I'm going to respond to these with the same response. 17,000 civilian casualties that we brought up in Yemen should not be blown off as to be expected and not necessarily innocent. These are 17,000 normal humans that aren't even involved in the conflict that are dying because of Saudi Arabia. He tries to blow it off by saying that, casualties are just a product of a conflict, and just because they're civilians doesn't mean they were innocent. He's trying to get past the fact that innocent people are dying, and there is no way to get past this. Now, on the subpoint B, human rights violations in Saudi Arabia itself, he also said that Trump is pushing for better training. If we look at Bazi, September 30th, He says this, the Saudis have made an empty promise to get the world off their backs. Nothing has changed. Airstrikes by the Saudis and their allies have caused most of the documented civilian casualties. The coalition admitted that the bombing was a mistake and that it would hold those committed mistakes accountable. U.S. officials seized on that statement as evidence that the Saudi coalition is willing to change its behavior, but for 3.5 years now there has been little evidence of any attempt by parties to the conflict to minimize civilian casualties. This was an empty promise and nothing has changed in 3.5 years. He also said that pulling aid makes Saudi Arabia complicit, worsening casualties. But if the U.S. pulls out, the UN steps in and will hold them accountable. Now, our second contention says legislation prevents sales. He said essentially, if it was against legislation, it would have stopped by now. First off, Congress is actually currently working on legislation to end sales to Saudi Arabia, so that takes that out. Secondly, it is against legislation, as we read, and voting pro is what makes it stop. For all these reasons, you must vote pro. So I started running out of time there. I saw I had about 30 seconds left whenever I was responding to the argument that pulling aid makes Saudi Arabia more complicit. So I really had to cut down there. I wanted to give more explanation. Essentially, the response with that is going to be that if the U.S. pulls out and we're not there to check Saudi Arabia, that gives the United Nations a chance to step in and do it themselves, and they are a much higher power to answer to. Now, the argument against the second point where he says, paraphrased, if it was against the legislation, it would have stopped. If it's illegal, it would have stopped already. I don't have a card for it. You can find it. Congress is working on legislation to end Saudi arms sales, so that's an argument right there. But also, you can just say, in the realm of this round, voting pro is what ends the arms sales. So that is solvency. That gives solvency to the judge in the pro side. Even though that is a really good attack. He says, there are guidelines within the legislation that say, if these are broken, we end it. So he's saying, since it's not stopping, it must not be illegal. That's not necessarily the case, and that's what I tried to point out. Now, his first two arguments on the civilian deaths in Yemen, casualties are to be expected, and civilian doesn't mean innocent necessarily. They're great attacks. That is a good way to get around that argument. But in response, you just have to pull the heartstrings and you have to tell the judge, again, 17,000 people have died because of Saudi Arabian attacks. A majority of them, even if some of them aren't innocent, a majority of them are, and that's too high of a number to just brush off as to be expected as a product of war. So that's the idea there. I don't know. I'd vote for me. I hope you would too. So let's go ahead and look at the next case. What we're going to be doing for the next case is actually the Iran trigger case, which I'm really excited about. So the pre-flow for this case is contention 1, one wrong move by Saudi Arabia triggers a US-Iran confrontation. This is pretty much just explaining how, since it's a proxy war between the United States supporting Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is fighting the Houthi rebels who are supported by Iran, if something happens, it ends up with a confrontation between the United States and Iran. This sets the stage for the impacts, which come into contention 2. The US will lose a conflict with Iran. Subpoint A, US-Iran war would result in massive US casualties. And then subpoint B, war game simulations show the US losing badly. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and read this case. Let's see how it goes. And my partner and I stand in firm affirmation of the resolution stated resolved. The United States should end its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It is because the U.S. support of the Saudi conflict in Yemen will lead to a war with Iran that we will lose. We believe ending sales is necessary. Contention 1. One wrong move by Saudi Arabia triggers a U.S.-Iran confrontation. From the International Crisis Group, January 11th. Tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia are rising. The U.S. has declared its intent to push back against Iran's regional influence and has offered limited but important assistance to the Saudi-led coalition's military campaign against the Houthis. An escalation in Yemen, including a successful Houthi missile strike on a Saudi or Emirati city, could lead to an escalatory dynamic conflict between Riyadh and Tehran and even act as a trigger for a direct US-Iranian confrontation. A Houthi missile strike on a Saudi or Emirati city that causes significant casualties or damage could prompt the US to retaliate against Iran. This could occur in Yemen by targeting Iranian-supplied weapons or other assets. Or, more dangerously, retaliation could occur directly on Iranian soil, for example by targeting missile factories or other Revolutionary Guards bases. The International Crisis Group is an organization that looks at current conflicts and sounds the alarm to prevent more conflicts. They say that based on the Saudi conflict in Yemen and the US support, one wrong move will lead to a war between the United States and Iran, based on Iran's support of the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Contention 2. The US will lose a conflict with Iran. Subpoint A. US-Iran war would result in massive US casualties. From Parsi 2018. In a direct force-on-force confrontation with the US, no conventional military in the Middle East stands a chance. That's precisely why the Iranians have prepared a completely different strategy. The Iranians know very well that the American public has little tolerance for war casualties. Thus, their defense strategy has been primarily aimed at deterring an attack by preparing attrition warfare that raises America's risk and costs. Instead of focusing on reducing Iran's own costs, the goal would be to cause as many US casualties as early and as quickly as possible, in order to strike a massive psychological blow to America's willingness to continue the fight. The strategy is not focused on directly defeating the US, but rather to make the cost of a victory politically non-viable for America. Iran watched the US fight in Iraq for years and they learned. They've prepared a strategy to make a US victory impossible. They will not care about their fighters or their funds. They will do whatever they can to kill as many US soldiers as possible to make us pull out. We cannot get into a direct conflict with Iran. Even in a fair fight, we lose, as we see in our subpoint B. War game simulations show the US losing badly. From Parsi again in 2018. The US is well familiar with Iran's non-conventional capabilities. In 2002, the Pentagon spent $250 million on a classified US war game called Millennium Challenge. The game envisioned the US Navy facing a coordinated Iranian assault in the Persian Gulf using swarming boats and missiles. The results were so devastating, the exercise was suspended and the perimeters controversially changed to ensure a US victory. The Iranians sank a total of 16 American ships, including an aircraft carrier. So based on war simulations, the United States loses to Iran every time, and pretty badly. US support and sale to Saudi Arabia is putting us in a situation on the brink of a war with Iran. This war will result in thousands of US casualties and the destruction of our military. We cannot afford to get into a direct conflict with Iran. To prevent this, we must end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. For these reasons and many more, we must urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you. So again, not too bad. 345 on that time. Let's do another quick sweep of this case. It's essentially our support of Saudi Arabia leads to a war with Iran that we lose. So because of that, we need to pull support from Saudi Arabia. Our contention 1 sets the stage for that, shows how our support of Saudi Arabia is putting us on the brink of that conflict or a confrontation with Iran, because a single wrong move by Saudi Arabia, since we support Saudi Arabia, could lead to Iran confronting us. Our contention 2 shows why that's bad, essentially showing overall, no matter what the situation is, we lose to Iran. Our subpoint A shows that Iran is actually going to not even care about their own people, their fighters, their costs. They're going to do whatever they can to make us quit. They're going to cause as many casualties to the United States military as possible, so that, quote, the cost of victory politically is non-viable for America. They don't care about actually winning. They're just going to make it so that public opinion makes it impossible for us to continue and win in the long run. Now, even if we did continue and we had a one-on-one confrontation, according to a war game simulation in our subpoint B, we get destroyed. We got destroyed so bad in this war game simulation that they changed the exercise drastically to ensure a US victory. The Iranians destroyed our navy in this simulation, including a huge aircraft carrier. The point is, based on everything we know, if we got into a conflict with Iran, we are losing. And our support of Saudi Arabia is getting us to that point where that could become possible very soon. So all that being said, that's the case. That's the Iran trigger case, available in Candor Briefs. Let's see what Lucas has to say in his attacking speech. The man, the myth, the legend. Lucas Monroe, everybody. He has his attacks ready, so let's see what he has to say against our pro case.
Yeah, so I'm getting into pro case 2 here, which is the one regarding U.S.-Iran conflict that Quentin read. And so let's just go ahead and dive right into the first contention, where he talks about how a U.S. misstep with the Saudi Arabia-Yemen conflict causes a U.S.-Iran conflict. And essentially he's saying that at the point that Houthi missile strikes escalate and begin to target U.S. soldiers and citizens in Saudi Arabia, it could escalate and cause an Iran conflict between the U.S., a direct war even. Got two responses to this. First one from Bazi in 2018. The first thing is we need to understand that the Houthis do not actually receive any significant support from Iran, that any speculation that the two are directly intertwined or that Iran is supporting them is false. And we have two different authors saying this. The other one is going to be Kindle in 2017, who goes so far as saying that the U.S. Embassy actually says there's no evidence to show a link between the Houthi rebels and Iran, that if anything, Iran is acting in silent compliance with the Houthis, just allowing them to exist to bleed Saudi Arabia dry, but they're not actually supporting them. And what this really is going to illustrate is that since Iran is not invested in the Houthis, were the conflict between the Houthis and the U.S. to escalate, or between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis to escalate, it wouldn't cause a conflict between Iran and the United States. They do not have ties. They're not supporting them. It's not someone they consider to be their ally. And this is important, especially looking at their contention too, where they're talking about how U.S. loses the Iran conflict. We link out of the entire impact of their contention too, because we just showed that an Iran conflict isn't even going to occur because there is no support from Iran to the Houthis. But if that isn't enough to convince you, let's just go ahead and talk about why that isn't even going to be a big deal if it were to occur. Subpoint A talks about U.S.-Iran war results in massive U.S. casualties. And essentially the evidence is addressing a World War II Hiroshima and Nagasaki approach, where during World War II, the United States had to weigh their political options and decided that a catastrophic strike against Japan that would break their will to fight was the best way to go about winning the war. And what they're suggesting with this evidence is that the Houthis would attempt the same thing against the U.S., or rather the Iran would cause the same thing against the U.S. if we were to escalate this confrontation, that they would attempt to cause as many casualties in catastrophic fashion as they could as fast as possible to break the U.S. fighting spirit. For one, I don't see this happening. The U.S. has a long history of having major losses in war and still pushing forward. For two, if we look to U.S. military intelligence from the Heritage Fund in 2017, and we're talking about if the Iran conflict was to escalate and they were to attempt anything, let's say on U.S. soil, since 9/11, there have been 97 terror plots effectively prevented and identified and prevented in the United States. And really all this is showing is that there's been an escalation of domestic terrorism since the 90s, but there's also been an escalation of domestic counterterrorism since the 90s. And really the only kind of attack that could have the significant psychological impact that my opponents are suggesting is something like 9/11, which won't happen under the status quo. We have too large of a focus on counterterrorism in the United States, and that would be prevented before it could occur. So really the only thing they could do is attack U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia, but anybody who's there, anybody who's engaging in this conflict, they're there willing to do what they have to do to finish the job out. They go to work knowing that there's a chance they might die. It's not a pretty world that we live in, but it's not something that's going to prevent U.S. war, or that's going to cause U.S. war. Subpoint B, they talk about a war game simulation showing us losing. First off, this simulation's from 2002. There's been a tremendous amount of change to U.S. military dynamics since then. But also, we've already linked out of the U.S.-Iran war already before this, so it falls for the same reasons that its subpoint A falls. For that reason, and everything we've talked about thus far, I can only see that negative ballot. Thank you.
4 minutes, 10 seconds. Not bad. You almost went over.
I know you showed me.
I almost did the knock on the table.
I had no idea what my first speech was anyway. I think it was like 5.5.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit long. So I'm gonna go ahead and write some rebuttals. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your approach was here?
Sure. So in the first contention, talks about how the Saudi misstep causes a U.S.-Iran conflict. The first thing I wanted to show was that the topic today isn't about the United States and Iran fighting. It's about Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebel group fighting. And essentially I was showing that, for one, the United States doesn't represent Saudi Arabia, and for two, Iran doesn't represent the Houthis. There's not a large link between either of those actors. So any conflict caused on their side isn't necessarily going to lead to us getting involved. So really, I just kind of tried to link out of the idea of conflict altogether by showing a couple of different different pieces of evidence that indicate that there's not clear support from Iran to the Houthi group, let alone even a report from the U.S. Embassy saying directly there is no evidence to show the link between the Houthi rebel group and Iran. And I feel like that's important, and that that's a significant block to the first contention. And all that evidence, everything we talk about today, is going to be available in the Candor brief. Contention 2, talking about U.S. loses the Iran conflict. Your contention 2 on this case is contingent upon your contention 1. If you can't prove that Iran is going to respond in the instance where a U.S. confrontation with the Houthi rebel group occurs, then you can't prove that an Iran confrontation is even going to happen. So if you can't prove that confrontation is even going to occur and your first contention falls, your second contention falls by default. Furthermore, I went ahead and blocked it anyway, just in case, in your rebuttal, you're able to rebuild and do a front line against my answer 2. And if you were able to bring up a front line, my further responses to your subpoint A and B, just talking about U.S. military strategy in the United States, I don't think we would back off in this instance. History just doesn't show us doing that. For 2, the only route they could take that would really have significant impact would be large-scale domestic terror attacks in the U.S., which don't happen really anymore. Every now and again, of course, one still slips through, but the amount of counterterrorism that we have in the United States now, the amount of work that's done by the United States Department of Defense and Homeland Security to stop these kinds of things from occurring, I just think it makes it unlikely that Iran, even if they were to get involved in this conflict in the first place, that they would be able to do anything significant enough to break the U.S. spirit. Plus, and I'm just thinking of this now, I wish I'd added it during the speech, when 9/11 happened, we didn't give up. We got pissed off, we got we got mad, and
I think we can say pissed off. I think that's fine.
Yeah, we got mad.
I'm not worried about it.
And we went and waged war and literally launched a massive ground assault for the first time in a long time. So I don't know if another country, short of nuking us or assassinating multiple high-level military or political figures simultaneously, I don't think another country could break the U.S. spirit for fighting right now. We are a war-hungry nation, and there's almost no doubt about that. And subpoint B, war game simulation showing us losing the conflict. I didn't have time to talk about it the way I wanted to, but for one, what you call us losing the conflict was actually considered to be a tactical loss of the Strait. That doesn't mean we actually lost the Strait. That just means that the cost of holding the Strait was greater than what we were willing to spend at the time. We would probably still be able to hold the Strait. It would just be costly. And that was really all this was trying to indicate. And I feel like the link out of the fact that the conflict would even occur in the first place really kind of subdues this.
Wait, the Strait.
Isn't this one about the Strait?
No.
No?
No.
Oh. Regardless.
No, that's the case we're gonna do.
Regardless, since 2002, a lot of things have changed.
Right.
And it was a war simulation, not an actual conflict.
Right. So you mean if the U.S.-Iran conflict happened at all,
and the situations that have been simulated were to occur, they were only considered losses because they were tactical losses.
Right.
We spent more than we wanted to spend to take the area we were talking about, at the time, the naval warfare that was simulated.
Gotcha. Okay.
But we would still be able to take it. It would just be costly.
Okay, gotcha.
Which to me doesn't indicate a loss, especially when we have the largest military in the world, indisputably.
Yeah. Well, let's see what I have to say to all that. So what we're going to look at is the attacks on the case, and I'm going to respond to them. I don't have a lot of evidence, actually. I'm going to do a lot of theory on this, so let's see how it works out. Our first contention is that Saudi Arabia's support puts us on a brink of conflict with Iran. He attacked this with two pieces of evidence from Bazzi 2018 and Kindle 17, saying that the Houthis aren't necessarily Iran, and even went as far as to say there is no evidence of support from Iran. Now, the Bazzi 2018 evidence actually says, quote, Iran has stepped up military assistance to the Houthis since the war. So this shows that there is support from Iran. And the Kindle 17 evidence, where it says there's no evidence of support, that was referencing a study that took place from 2004 to 2010, and things really picked up in 2015 after that study was done. So the Houthis are an extension of Iran, as we've proven with the evidence he brought up, so he can't link out of this argument. Now, our second contention is that we lose to Iran. Our subpoint A is that there will be massive U.S. casualties. He attacks this by saying, again, that they linked out of it by saying Iran aren't Houthis, and vice versa, but again, we already beat that. He also said that there were 97 terror plots prevented since 9/11, so he wouldn't allow terror attacks on U.S. soil, but that's not what we're talking about. Whenever we talk about massive U.S. casualties to Iran, we're saying that they will be doing guerrilla attacks, they will be placing IEDs, they will be doing whatever they can to annihilate as many U.S. soldiers as possible to make it impossible for us to continue fighting Iran in any sort of conflict. We're not necessarily talking about terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, we're talking about U.S. soldiers getting destroyed in a conflict. Now, our subpoint B talks about simulations showing us losing badly. He says, first, a lot has changed since 2002, but the evidence from 2018 referencing all of this still shows us losing. Our subpoint A is from 2018. Our subpoint B is from 2018. Just because one simulation references from 2002 doesn't mean that we will win. Things haven't changed enough for us to not get annihilated. And again, he says we've already linked out of it by showing Iran isn't supporting the Houthis, but they are, as the evidence has shown from Bazzi and from Kindle in 2018 and 2017. So for these reasons, we need to see that the Houthis are Iran, and we cannot win a war with Iran. Thank you. What do you think? Was that a good rebuttal?
Yeah, I don't like that your blocks are bad.
What do you mean?
There's a block built into your block for the block.
What?
Like, in the packet that you showed me, that block to the concept that I'm looking at the wrong flow. Yeah. So your Bazzi and Kindle blocks have blocks to themselves in the own card.
Well,
those are bad pieces of evidence.
Let's look at. Okay, chill out. Hold on.
Like, why would anybody want to read that if it's just countering itself immediately?
So this says the Houthis did not receive significant support from Tehran before the Saudi intervention in 2015. Iran has stepped up military assistance to the Houthis since the war, and Hezbollah has begun sending military advisors to train the Yemeni rebels, but the cost of this assistance fall far short. You just didn't read this part in your attack where it says...
No, I talked about that, though.
Oh, I didn't hear it.
Yeah, I talked about how Iran isn't taking an active interest in the conflict. Rather, they're just letting the Houthi rebel group continue to act so that Saudi Arabia is just having problems and it bleeds them dry.
Well, so my point was, your argument was that Iran isn't supporting them whatsoever. And I just wanted to show that, even if it is just a little bit, there is a connection.
Yeah.
Right? Also, I mean, these pieces of evidence are totally saying that Iran and Houthis are barely connected. I just twisted them enough to be able to show that there is some sort of connection. You know what I mean? Because this one where it says from 2004 to 2010, it goes on to say that more recent evidence from interviews with Houthis suggests that Iran does not enjoy command and control over them. I just brought up the part where you said there's no evidence of support was from 2010. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just seems counterproductive to even bring it up then if it's not relevant anymore.
Well, it is. And that's sort of an issue that in this format that we're doing, this would be cleared up in a single crossfire,
Yeah.
like we're doing right now.
No, that makes sense.
You know, but with just a case attack rebuttal, it's easy to kind of get things mixed up. And I didn't have a response other than looking at the evidence and trying to twist it in whatever way I could.
Okay. Well, I still have 2 more cases to cover.
Oh yeah. So now we're gonna switch to the con side, right?
Yes.
All right. So let me find that con case.
Have you read either of the con cases at this point?
Nope.
Nope. So just both pro cases?
Yep.
I thought you already read one of the con cases while I was working responses. No?
I read that second pro case.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well.
So this is going to be the first con case, the default lay about security and counterterrorism. Quick pre-flow. Contention 1, arms sales assist with Saudi's counterterrorism. Contention 2 is that U.S. cooperation is key to counterterrorism. And subpoint A is that U.S. cooperation is key overall. Subpoint B, the Saudis are now succeeding at counterterror. So let's go ahead. And remember, we're switching over to con now. I'm con. Lucas is going to be pro whenever he attacks, and I'm going to be con whenever I give a rebuttal. So, Lucas, are you ready for this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you mute my mic?
Yes. So, if everybody is ready. My partner and I stand in firm negation of the resolution stated resolved. The United States should end its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It is because our relationship with Saudi Arabia is crucial to counterterrorism and security in the region, we must stand in negation. Contention 1. Arms sales assist with Saudi's counterterrorism. From the U.S. Department of State, 2017. This package of defense equipment and services supports the long-term security of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region in the face of malign Iranian influence and Iranian-related threats. Additionally, it bolsters the kingdom's ability to provide for its own security and continue contributing to counterterrorism operations across the region, reducing the burden on U.S. military forces. The intended sales fall broadly into 5 categories: border security and counterterrorism, maritime and coastal security, air force modernization, air and missile defense, and cybersecurity and communication upgrades. They present the opportunity to significantly augment the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's capabilities to help deter regional threats and enhance its ability to protect its borders and contribute to coalition counterterrorism operations. Border security and counterterrorism has the effect of training that will enable Saudi Arabia to secure its borders against terrorist and other threats. Maritime and coastal security ends with capabilities that will enable Saudi Arabia to defend freedom of navigation and to deter and defend against maritime attacks or incursions. So the arms that we sell to Saudi Arabia are crucial to counterterrorism efforts and checking Iran's regional power. Contention 2. U.S. cooperation is key to counterterrorism. Subpoint A. U.S. cooperation is key. From the Middle East Policy Council 2017. A joint venture between the U.S. and Saudi governments to provide training and support to a 30,000-man Saudi force tasked with protecting domestic oil and gas facilities. This successful effort, building on others before it, reaffirmed Saudi Arabia as the country with the greatest counterterrorism cooperation with the United States globally. Ambassador Frank underlined the continued cooperation with the U.S. Department of Treasury to stymie terrorist access to funding, another example of how U.S.-Saudi cooperation continues to go from strength to strength. So U.S. cooperation with Saudi Arabia has been key to counterterrorism efforts in the area. We have trained a 30,000-man task force, resulting in foiled terror plots outlined in our subpoint B. The Saudis are now succeeding at counterterror. From Al-Arabiya 2017. Security officials in Saudi Arabia have released the official data on how terrorism was combated in 2016. The outcomes of those efforts have led to the following outcomes: the protection of 1 million Muslims at the Prophet's Mosque, the protection of 60,000 spectators in Jeddah, the protection of 400 civilians in Strait, 190 arrests of ISIS-affiliated terrorists, and the tactical prevention of 7 suicide attacks targeting a number of mosques. Based on the U.S. support and cooperation, Saudi Arabia was able to protect over 1 million lives and arrest nearly 200 ISIS terrorists. This would not have been possible without the arms sale relationship with the United States. It is because arms sales to Saudi Arabia are key to regional stability, security, and counterterrorism efforts, we must urge a negative ballot in today's debate. Thank you. A little short there. Say again.
Probably could have just read it slower.
Yeah,
but
I always end up reading a little bit fast because I'm used to trying to pack a lot of evidence in.
yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't work out.
Would you scroll up for me real quick for the subpoint A?
Yeah. This right here?
Yeah, and then back down.
That right there?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to see.
Okay. Let me write this down real quick. I forgot to pre-flow it.
Just let me know when you're ready.
Yeah.
In the filler time in between, I'll just hum us some smooth jazz.
Tell him something sweet.
Tell him something sweet?
Yeah.
Hey, we're an hour and 13 minutes into this. If you're still watching, I love you. But not in that weird, like, I want to wear your face kind of way, but more in that, like, I want you to tag me in all your cool debates and successes so I can be like, hey, good job in the comments.
Nice.
And I know if you're using our evidence and you're listening to our podcast, you're going to be having that kind of success.
Ooh.
Just kidding. We're bad. Does that count? Something sweet?
I think so.
Okay. No, but for real, I like you guys a lot. You're helping us keep doing this, and you're giving us a reason to wake up in the morning. So.
Yeah, truly.
And when you get to this point in life, that's all you need. With that being said, I think Quentin is ready for my responses. And we're going to go ahead and dive right in to his first contention concerning arms, aid, and counterterrorism. And this whole contention is talking about the idea that the U.S. supply of arms to Saudi Arabia and the training and counterterrorism efforts that we're making there are helping us fight terrorism in that region, or rather helping Saudi Arabia fight terrorism in that region. I don't necessarily disagree with this. However, I do have the point from Newton 2017 that talks about how foreign aid and intervention in Saudi Arabia, specifically from the United States, causes U.S. Sentiment to decline in the region. Now, what we're looking at is a bit of counterproductive instances here, where effectively the negative team is saying we need to continue the counterterrorism support that we have in Saudi Arabia, which sounds good initially, but what we're showing you is the affirmative right now is that continued support is causing more terrorism to occur. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. Now, if one is depleting the other faster than the other one's being created, no one's here to say. I can't tell you for sure that we're creating more terrorists than we're stopping. And I don't think that Quentin can come up here and say for sure that we're stopping more terrorists than we're creating. What I can show you, though, is that this specific approach that you're getting on the negative side is causing more terrorism than currently exists. And that is just not something that we can abide on the affirmative side of today's debate. But furthermore, going down to their second contention, they talk about how the United States is key, in their subpoint A specifically, the United States cooperation is key to this relationship and to these counter-terrorist efforts. And what we need to understand here is that the approach that we're taking with these direct counterterrorism efforts is actually a short-term war approach. And the evidence specifically in the contention, subpoint A outlines this. There are three different ways to approach combating terrorism, especially in the Middle East. There's the long-term, medium-term, and short-term approach. The short-term approach is the direct arrest and killing of high-value terrorist targets day in and day out, and that's what they're advocating here for. But what you'll find is that the evidence itself actually says that the long-term effect of changing the hearts and minds of the people is actually a more effective way to stop these terrorist attacks from happening. And this is just the part that's conveniently unhighlighted by the affirmative team. So if we tie that back to the Newton evidence that we used in response to their first contention, talking about how U.S. involvement is creating an increased amount of U.S. anti-U.S. sentiment in the region, we only see that this is our short-term response and our short-term outcome. The short-term outcome is negative U.S. sentiment in the United States whenever we cooperate militarily. We don't have to be doing a military intervention. We don't have to be doing military aid to have these same kinds of effects. We could be doing it a different way. And really, that's why we're standing as the affirmative today. We don't need to be in Saudi Arabia providing military aid the way that we are. Furthermore, Tim in 2016 actually talks about how there's been a response from al-Qaeda because of U.S. counterterrorist efforts against the Houthis in Saudi Arabia and in Yemen. essentially there's been a power vacuum effect that more or less all of the area that we clear out from Houthis that we don't seize control of immediately just gets sucked up by al-Qaeda. And this really furthers the point about anti-US sentiment. We're not stopping all terrorist activity just by helping Saudi Arabia and stopping the Houthis. The al-Qaeda just steps in and takes their place in the same places, and they're just creating a power vacuum where more and more US sentiment, anti-US sentiment is building, and more terrorist groups are just going to step in and take the spot. And until we can come up with a solution that uses soft power for its primary focus, we're not going to be able to avoid this kind of negative outcome. And finally, there's subpoint B. It talks about how Saudis are now succeeding in counterterrorism, and they list all these great examples, and they try to reference the 30,000 man task force that was brought up in their subpoint A. The evidence in subpoint A talks about a 30,000 man task force that was trained and created in May of 2017, whereas the evidence in subpoint B talks about 2016 terrorist operations that were actually stopped. It doesn't say that it was this task force. It doesn't say that it was U.S. involvement whatsoever. This just could have been the Saudi Arabian military operating on its own, and they can't show a specific link to the U.S. that we were the ones who helped this. If anything, it just doesn't apply to itself, so really it's non-topical. And it's because of that and all the reasons aforementioned that I can't see anything but that negative ballot. Thank you. Yeah, so right before the debate, when I asked you if you could scroll up to subpoint A and then back down to B, that's what I was checking was dates.
The dates, yeah.
Because you pointed out that the evidence shows that the group was created in 2017, sometime in May, because that's the earliest we can say for sure that they existed. And then the other evidence talks about terrorist operations that were prevented in 2016.
Let me see if this...
And it may have been created. It may have been that task force. It just doesn't specify. And so I decided to prey on that.
Yeah. I mean, attack it anyway. The worst that'll happen is you were wrong.
Yeah. I mean, this would be your great chance to show, excellent preparation on your part and be like, actually, that task force was established in 2015 and they were directly responsible for this as illustrated by the blank evidence.
But I don't know if I have that.
Yeah.
Honestly.
It might be something good to find.
Yeah. So talk a little bit. I'm gonna work on this rebuttal.
Okay. So my whole approach here was to show that the counter-terrorist operations are not necessarily stopping more terrorism than they're causing. And it really was just to try to make the whole negative side seem non-consequential. Because at best, we're creating as many terrorists as we're stopping, because I don't think either side has evidence to prove that for a fact we are stopping more terrorists than we're creating, or we're creating more terrorists than we're stopping. So then at that point, logically, you just have to agree somewhere in the middle and just say, maybe we're just creating just as many terrorists as we're stopping. But at that point, it still flows to the affirmative side that we need to pull out, because there's really no point for us to be there if we're not accomplishing our goal. And that was kind of my logic and approach to attacking contention 1. Contention 2, talking about the United States, is key. The U.S. has a lot of approaches to these kinds of operations, and in the evidence that Quentin happened to pick for this case, it outlined the 3 different approaches for counter-terrorist operations in that region, in Saudi Arabia and in Yemen. And effectively, it said itself that short-term approach, which is literally going in, fighting terrorism with soldiers and arresting terrorists as much as we can, is the least effective. It said that the most effective approach is the long-term approach, which is where you win over the hearts and minds of the people so that they turn against the terrorist groups and they denounce them and try to, move for a more legitimate government. And yeah, I think that is an effective block in itself, but then that's why I brought up the power vacuum following that. The concept that the short-term war is creating that exact same anti-US sentiment that I pointed out in the first contention, and it's not even doing its job in stopping terrorism. It's just allowing other terrorist groups to move in and take the place of the Houthi rebels. And it actually went so far as to say, I didn't read it, but in that evidence it says that al-Qaeda is at its highest point that it's been in 20 years because of US involvement against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And I thought that was pretty big. That was just trying to further illustrate my point of, we're not necessarily stopping any more terrorists than we're producing. We're probably just breaking even. And then subpoint B, Saudis are now succeeding at counterterrorism. You already heard my whole approach to that. I was just trying to show that the coalition that this subpoint A is talking about is not the coalition that subpoint B is talking about, and that subpoint B is not necessarily talking about anything that has to do with U.S. support of Saudi Arabia, because it doesn't specifically say that. And I was just hoping that you wouldn't have a block to that, because if you didn't, then I feel like the point falls. So yeah, that was my whole thought process.
Nice, okay. Well, I think I have a pretty good response. Let me pull this card up just so I know what I'm reading in my case. There it is. Okay. I'm going to turn your mic off. So, that was a great attacking speech. You made some really good links. Some stuff I wasn't expecting. So let's see if I can pull this out here. Oh, that was also... What was the card on your first attack on my first contention? It was Newton 17, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. All right. Looking at our first contention that arms sales assist with Saudi's counterterrorism, my opponent attacked this with Newton 2017, showing that actually arms sale caused U.S. sentiment to decline. The evidence itself says it's because of Yemeni citizens blaming the U.S. for airstrikes in Yemen, harming civilians. So if we fast forward a year later, Hartung March 2018 shows that Saudi Arabia bought $750 million worth of training to reduce civilian casualties from airstrikes. So we are working with Saudi Arabia to reduce the effect of to reduce these civilian casualties that are causing U.S. sentiment to decline. So we're solving for that issue. Our first contention still stands strong. Our second contention is that U.S. cooperation is key. On our subpoint A, he says that we're actually boosting al-Qaeda. Now I'm going to link this attack with his attack on our subpoint B that says there is no link between our U.S. support and the foiled terrorist plots. If we look to Al-Jaber 2016, he shows that Saudi Arabia is actually making big strides against terrorism. Saudi Arabia has worked with other nations to combat terrorism, both diplomatically and militarily. Now, note diplomatically there, take note of that because he said we need to fight for the war of hearts and minds and not necessarily on the ground, which we are working to do. Through a $110 million grant, Saudi Arabia helped establish the United Nations Counterterrorism Center to combat terrorism. Saudi Arabia has established fusion cells where law enforcement and intelligence officials from Saudi Arabia, the United States, and other partners work closely together to investigate and interdict terrorism plots and finances. So this shows that even if those exact examples shown in our subpoint B don't have a direct link to the United States support, our subpoint A shows that the cooperation is key to all counterterrorism since our relationship has started with Saudi Arabia. But even further, there's a couple more examples of Saudi Arabia and the United States working together specifically to stop terrorism and terrorism plots and the financing of terrorism. So for these reasons, you must vote con. Thank you. What do you think of that? What? Oh, yeah. What didn't you hear in that speech?
I didn't hear a block to the al-Qaeda power vacuum.
I mean, I linked it. I said, he said we're boosting al-Qaeda. I'm going to link this with the terrorist plots, the foiling of terrorist plots not having U.S. support. And I just linked it to that card about how we're making strides through.
Yeah, no, I think I kind of got where you were trying for. I just still don't.
Yeah, I didn't have a direct block to...
I don't know, yeah, because I tried to come up with a full-scale, singular argument, essentially, against your entire case, which is talking about counterterrorism. Yeah. And that argument being that we can't prove for a matter of a fact that we're making more benefit than harm in the region. And so, at a certain point, you have to cut your losses.
yeah, I didn't have a direct block, so I did my best to find...
I feel like you did a good job.
Some sort of U.S. Saudi Arabia counterterrorism.
Yeah.
With some numbers and some keywords, you know. And I tried my best to link to show that our subpoint B does show a link between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia based on what we said in our subpoint A.
No, yeah, and I liked the card you read in between that, where you talked about the fusion cells.
Yeah.
Because I think that the fusion cells existing in 2016 can allow you to logically assume
Right.
that counter-terrorist operations conducted in 2016 would have at least been partially a result.
Yes, some sort of cooperation there.
You probably should have pointed it out,
Yeah,
but you didn't really have time.
I didn't have time.
Yeah.
I was over already.
But yeah, that was still good. I liked it.
Cool.
The fusion cells, honestly, I like the fusion cells argument more than I like your subpoint B.
Yeah. The subpoint B is just a good impact card.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or maybe I like it better than I like your subpoint A.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, actually I do.
Subpoint A
Because
is
your
just a link
subpoint
card.
A is what gave me the idea of using long-term versus short-term
Yeah,
war, and kind of gave me some ammunition against you.
right. Let's so we're going on a minute or an hour and a half. Let's finish up this last debate, tie up some loose ends, and call it a night. What do you say?
Oh, excuse me. I'm so sorry.
Jesus. I'm gonna remember to try to just mute that out.
Yeah, please
That was
do.
disgusting.
That was gross.
If I forget to, I'm so sorry if you hear that.
Yeah, it was a pretty gross gurgly burp.
So we're moving on to the second con case. This one is about the Bab al-Mendab Strait. This is where Lucas got mixed up earlier talking about the Strait. This is why. This case, as a pre-flow, is just about this strait that is used for a lot of trade every single day. And our impacts
Most
relating,
of the trade, actually.
Yeah, pretty much all trade that isn't in one continent. Contention 1 is that the U.S. needs to maintain stability to keep the Bab al-Mandeb Strait secure. Contention 2 is that Iran and the Houthis are attempting to take the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. Subpoint A is that Iran is practicing taking the strait now. Subpoint B is that this disrupts supplies, oil markets, and freedom of navigation. And contention 3 is that the U.S. cannot afford to pull out and ignore the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. So are you ready, Lucas?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to turn off your mic.
Please
and get
do,
started.
so we don't have to hear any more gross.
Yeah. Please don't burp.
All right.
So, if everybody's ready, I'm going to go ahead and begin. My partner and I stand in firm negation of the resolution stated resolved. The United States should end its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It has been said that he who holds the key to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait does not need nuclear weapons. It is because the strait is crucial to U.S. interests we must negate. Contention 1. U.S. needs to maintain stability to keep the Bab el-Mandeb Strait secure. From Lab 2016. The U.S. has backed the Saudi-led coalition. U.S. interests include maintaining stability in Yemen and security for Saudi borders, free passage in the Bab el-Mandeb, the choke point between the Arabian and Red Seas through which 4.7 million barrels of oil per day transit. Stability in Yemen through support of Saudi Arabia is key to free passage to the Bab el-Mandeb. What would happen if we pulled support from Saudi Arabia? Contention 2 shows Iran and Houthis are attempting to take the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Subpoint A is that Iran is practicing taking the strait right now. From Trevithick, August 2018. Iran may be in the process of something of a dry run in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, or is otherwise using that zone to explore just what it can do directly and indirectly to impede international maritime traffic. Subpoint B continues and shows the impact by saying this disrupts supplies, oil markets, and freedom of navigation. From Zauk, August 2018. The Iran's suspicious involvement in the ongoing Yemeni civil war in favor of Houthi movement against the government is considered by some analysts as being part of a military strategy through which Iran will deploy its naval forces from the Strait of Hormuz. Iran would be able to block and threaten maritime oil tankers traffic by controlling the Bab el-Mandeb using the Houthis. This would put new cards in Iran's hands to utilize in its regional and international relations, as it seems recently from the last military maneuvers held by Iranian Navy near the Strait of Hormuz to respond to U.S. reimposed sanctions. Such navigation blocking eventually is likely to disrupt the supplies, increase the oil markets, and can evolve to a more complex conflict where USA will intervene. Finally, terrorism threat will remain a serious concern for stability and freedom of navigation in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So if the United States pulls support from Saudi Arabia, Iran and the Houthis take control of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as they've been practicing. This results in a disruption of supply trade, increased oil market prices, and a much more complex conflict where the U.S. must take action. Which means contention 3, the U.S. cannot afford to pull out and ignore the Bab el-Mandeb. From Coffee, July 2018. The threat posed to shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb from Yemen is real. In 2016, missiles were fired by the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels at a U.S. Navy warship near the Bab el-Mandeb. Houthi forces also have deployed mines along Yemen's coast and used a remote-controlled boat packed with explosives. When you combine Djibouti's economic and political problems with Yemen's security challenges, you get a deadly geopolitical cocktail directly threatening international shipping and U.S. interests. Considering oil tankers transport approximately 4.7 million barrels of oil per day through the Bab el-Mandeb, the stakes are even higher. Thanks to this and Iran's increasing role in the region, the U.S. cannot afford to ignore the Bab el-Mandeb. So the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is one of the most important straits for trade and oil supplies. It has 4.7 million barrels of oil pass through it every single day. Iran and the Houthis are attempting to take control of it right now, which would result in major oil price increases, no freedom of navigation, and difficulties with international trade. Consider it as this. Imagine Iran taking control of major highways and interstates so that every time you wanted to go somewhere, you had to go hours or days out of your way. This is the cost we are talking about. The United States cannot afford to ignore the Bab el-Mandeb. For these reasons and many more, we must urge a negative ballot. Thank you. 4 minutes on the dot. Big yeet. 4 minutes on the dot. Big yeet.
Yeah,
Sorry. I always forget to start your mic up again.
That's okay. Yeah, good case, man.
Thank you.
I like it.
I read it earlier today. I practice debated because one of the kids was gone. So I had the timing down.
That's good.
What are your thoughts?
I think that I'm ready.
All right.
And if everyone else is ready, I'll go ahead and get started with my opponent's first contention, where they talk about how the United States needs to maintain stability for the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The first contention is really more of an observation, just predicating the entire concept of what their case is. And really, in response to this, I just simply have to say we disagree. And I have more reasons to talk about in response to their second and third contentions that actually contain their impacts. So the second contention, where they talk about how Iran and Houthis will take the Strait. Subpoint A, they're talking about how Iran has essentially been practicing to take the Strait. First thing I want to say is that it's speculation. The article uses a lot of mights and coulds, and it even goes on to insinuate that it may not even, the primary reason they're doing this practices may not even be to take the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So with that in mind, we have to realize their own evidence needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But if that isn't enough to convince you, let's go ahead and look to Gulf News in 2018, which goes on to say that Iran wouldn't get involved with a war to take the Strait. And essentially the reason for is that they would get sanctioned super hard, and it would be impractical. The only reason that a country would want to take control of a maritime route would be to gain economic power. And if that move is going to result in economic sanctions that are going to hurt the economy, then it doesn't make any sense to make it. You can't make a move to take an economic area if you're not going to be able to sell that product in the first place. Furthermore, just because they've taken the Strait doesn't mean they're taking the oil. Those oil shipments can still be moved through other places, and we're going to talk about that more in a second. And their subpoint B, they talk about how it disrupts oil, trade, and supplies, and it may cause U.S. intervention and increase terrorism in the area. If the U.S. has to intervene, the U.S. has to intervene. That doesn't stop us from voting pro in today's debate, because U.S. intervention is different than U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So if we feel the need to intervene in the Strait, we will. Furthermore, the U.S. isn't the only person with an interest in the Strait. It's not necessarily our responsibility to aid for the stability in this region. And in fact, in his own evidence, the part that he didn't highlight, it says that France and other countries will intervene to secure oil supplies and to stabilize its prices by controlling these straits and the routes leading to them. So his evidence solves. If Iran moves in and tries to take this strait, France and other countries that all have interests in the strait area will secure it, and they'll stabilize the prices by moving in and doing it themselves. The United States doesn't have to maintain its involvement in Saudi Arabia to be able to do this. We could intervene without it, and there's other people that are going to do it anyway. But furthermore, looking to the third contention, saying that U.S. citizens, or the U.S. can't afford it because of 4.7 million oil barrels that go through there every day. Here's some interesting knowledge from Johnson in 18. It's actually 2/3 of the global oil supply that goes through this strait every day. and it's 18 million barrels. It's not 4.7 million. That's only the barrels that come from Saudi Arabia is the 4.7 million. When you're considering everybody, it's 18 million. And I think that really just further expands upon the attacks I've made thus far. The concept that the US isn't the only person that has an interest in stopping an Iran or a Houthi-controlled Bab al-Mendeb Strait. Lots of people, 2/3 of the world that rely on oil, are interested in stopping this from happening. It's not a real threat. It's not something Iran would do. Again, if they're doing it to make an economic move, they're only going to get sanctioned, and that's just going to hurt their economy. So it's not a smart economic move to make. But even further than that, oh, I lost my spot. Oh yeah, Saudi Arabia can actually reroute their oil sales via the Red Sea and through South Africa. So all of this being taken into account, let's say worst case scenario, Iran and the Houthi rebels take the Strait. They don't even need the Strait to move the same amount of oil. They can have other routes available that are more secure, and maybe they'll take a little bit longer, but trade will still occur. And because of that, and the fact that really this entire argument is non-consequential and it doesn't even have to be done by the United States in the first place, I can't see anything but that affirmative ballot. Thank you.
That was a pretty solid attack, actually. I wish you'd attacked our first contention, but it really is just sort of an observation. But okay. I have a lot of stuff written down here. Let's hope I can get it done in 2 minutes. Me too. All right. Looking at our first contention that the U.S. needs to maintain stability in the Strait, our opponents really didn't attack this, so it still stands. If we look at our second intention of Iran and Houthis want control of the Strait, subpoint A, Iran is practicing taking the Strait now. First, my opponent said that there's a lot of speculation because there's a lot of mights and coulds in this article. On July 26th, Saudi Arabia temporarily halted oil shipments through the Strait because of a Houthi attack on oil tankers. This is no longer a hypothetical situation. Now, he also attacked this by saying that Iran won't do this because of sanctions. First off, De Christopher on October 15th says the US has already sanctioned Iranian oil. Secondly, our subpoint B shows that we have already imposed overall sanctions on Iran. So sanctions aren't a threat to Iran. They have nothing to worry about anymore. They have nothing to lose. Iran is definitely practicing taking this Strait, and sanctions aren't a threat to prevent this because they're already happening in every sense of the word. Now, our subpoint B is that it disrupts oil supplies, or disrupts supplies, oil markets, and freedom of navigation. My opponent attacked this by saying the United States is not the only country with interests. It won't only be the United States or other countries like France and other countries. First off, when has France ever done anything internationally? Secondly, the U.S. has the most interest because Saudi Arabia is the #2 oil supplier to the United States. And since we have sanctioned Iranian oil, we rely entirely on Saudi Arabian oil. Now, moving on to our third contention of that the United States cannot afford to ignore this, my opponent attacked this by saying that Saudi Arabia can reroute oil sales. Johnson 2018 shows that actually the more unstable the Strait becomes, the more unstable prices become, no matter what route we're taking. To quote, he actually says these tight conditions in the oil market because of geopolitical situations will make it ripe for higher prices as soon as something goes wrong. The oil market can no longer ignore geopolitical issues like this. So for these reasons and many more, I must urge that negative ballot. Thank you. It was a little messy. Just a tiny bit messy.
Yeah, for me, the immediate problem I point out, in response is you said the Houthis made one attack on the Strait and that halted sales for a little bit. And then you go on to say Iran's definitely going to do this. To me, Iran and the Houthis aren't interchangeable.
Right.
So I don't see how just because the Houthis have made one attack, why Iran's going to go ahead and do this.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is the sanctions we've made thus far aren't the most sanctioning we can do. We can always sanction more.
Right.
And I mean, sanctions were the whole reason that Iran was willing to step down their nuclear program.
Yeah.
So we can show that they do work, but I just don't have time to address that because we're not doing that format.
Right. This format does make it difficult for that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm kind of salty you didn't read a card with a real non-hypothetical impact until I attacked, and then you brought it up as an answer. I kind of wish that had been in your case so we could have had a real discussion.
Wait, which one?
The answer to your subpoint A. Where, because I said your subpoint A was speculation, you were like, it's not speculation. Here's a real instance of where they attacked it. And I was like,
I'm pretty sure that isn't the case.
It's not.
I'm almost positive.
It's all like Iran would be able to, Iran could, but none of it actually shows.
I really thought that it was in there.
Yeah, and so that's why I hit you on being speculative, and then you turn around and pull up evidence of it actually happening, which is a good move on your part.
Well, it's
just for the
to be fair, it's in. I just didn't realize it's not highlighted. It's in subpoint A.
And that's not the same thing, though. That's just Saudi Arabia saying it halted oil shipments through that equally constrained waterway after a pair of attacks on its oil tank. Oh, no, you're right.
Yeah, with
that's the thing. But that's still the Houthi rebels, not Iran.
Right. Well, the overall contention is that Iran and Houthis are attempting to take the Strait.
Yeah, and I guess my follow-up, it's something I should have hit in my attacking speech initially, is that, like, why are we talking about Iran at all? Today's resolution is about pulling support of U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And then that would force you to waste time showing all the connections in your rebuttal.
Stuff, yeah.
But that was a time suck for both of us, and I didn't really want to do it.
Yeah. I'm tired.
Yeah,
we just did 4 debates.
Gross.
They were short, but yeah. This is a little bit exhausting. That being said, we hope it was beneficial if you're still listening. I don't know what the time will be after I edit this, but we're currently sitting at 1:45, so I think we're going to wrap this up. Again, there's not going to be a second release for the Saudi Arabia topic, but use the code OIL for $5 off.
Promo code OIL.
The first release. I think that's all I got. You got anything?
I don't think I have anything. Just wanted to thank you again for listening this far in. Your continued support means more than you know.
That being said, coolio. I'm Quentin Cooper.
And I'm Lucas Monroe.
Thanks, enjoy, and good luck.
Every time